questions before we dive into state legislative history? If I did not reply to you, if you send in your statutes assignment, that's because probably you sent it after 3:30 or so, which is totally fine. Just make sure that you get my reply no later than tomorrow morning, probably when I will get to it. Also, I will ask you, and we'll talk about the legislative history assignment at the end of class, but I want to remember to ask you now, when you send in any future, the next 3 assignments, if you could put your name as part of the file name, so your name, assignment 3, and whatever, it'll just make it easier for me to keep track of everybody's assignment. And also, please make sure to put your name on the actual assignment. Now that I'm doing everything electronically in terms of getting it back to you, it'll just make sure that I get everybody the right assignment back to the right person. Speaking of which, you all did get your assignment ones back and you were able to read the comments. Okay, good, so that system is working. All right then, let's dive into legislative history for states. Pretty much, if you understand the process as it works on the federal end, then it's kind of the same with the state as I like to say that the concepts are the same, but the names have been changed to, well, not really to protect the innocent, but the names have just been changed. So we've seen that on our sources handout, so instead of public laws in the federal world, they're called chapter laws. In New York, in different names in different states. When we talked about this when we talked about statutes. The difference is a little bit greater in states because every state does it differently and it's up to the states. So you will not find as many documents for states and you will not find the documents as easily. And you may laugh because you may not think federal legislative history is all that easy to find. Well, the documents themselves in states are even more difficult, especially when you're not in the state. In fact, you pretty much have to rely on whatever you can find on the web. So speaking of what we find on the web, I have, there's a website here, and obviously Googling works too. And if you have another walkthrough, by the way, are these useful? I am not... They take a little bit of work. I don't mind doing the work if you find them helpful, but I also have no desire to kill trees if you think they're a waste of time. So every year I like to ask, after we've looked at a few of them, if people still find them useful, because like I said, I really would rather not kill the trees if people can't be bothered with them. So I'm seeing heads shaking. Yes, and I won't be offended if you say no. Like I said, it's just a function of not wanting to waste. Okay, so thank you for that input.
I was going to say we can make them like e-copies on Twin if that saves the trees. Some sort of because they're useful, we could kill 2 birds with 1 stone, or save 2 birds with 1 stone.
I could just put these on Twin, but will you find that I use them mostly, well, for 2 reasons. So you can see up close and personal in class what I'm talking about, because I know the screens aren't exactly clear. But second, also for you to refer back to. Obviously, putting it on Twin for that second purpose works just fine. Would that work to have it on your laptops? You would find it okay to go back and forth between screens as opposed to paper and screen?
Probably print it out. That's just
so
we can print it visually, so you would have to.
Well, I mean, at this point, I'm probably going to give you a couple more. So how about this? I will continue to do the print version for those of you who like print, but I will also put them a PDF of it online, so we can see. Okay, thank you for the input. So going back to our handout, now that we've determined we like it one way or the other. So website. If you remember this exists, obviously you can just Google State Legislative History Guide. What you might want to do if you don't remember this exists, if you have to do legislative history, especially in a state that you are not in, is, for those of you, is to just look for California Legislative History Guide, or New Jersey, or Massachusetts, whatever your favorite state may be. If you remember this guide exists, then that works too. And what this guide does, we'll take a look at New York, since we'll be looking at New York in a moment, is it gives you links to various websites where you can learn more about how to research legislative history for that state. The other thing I should point out, I think I mentioned this in one of our earlier classes, was for those of you who still like books, if there are anybody left, there are also state print research guides. I highly recommend this New York one if you are going to be practicing in New York. It does go into more detail than I found on whatever guides that are available on the web, and if there's some little specialized aspect of state legislative history that I don't remember or don't know, or I have to look into California legislative history, then I would go to the California guide and find that really useful. So the bottom line is, don't panic if you get a question either for New York or other state legislative history. Think, oh my God, I don't remember. Just remember there are the guides out there, and that's actually kind of true for all aspects of research, but especially legislative history, because people do find that confusing. So what I am going to do is to go through New York in some detail. Again, it's going to be different for different states, but the guides to check that out. But since many of you will be, at least initially, planning to stay here in New York, let's take a look and see how that works. And New York has some, I think, uniqueness, but probably every state has some uniqueness. So let's turn the page on our handout. And again, the circumstances that will arise when you have to do legislative history research are more likely going to be, you've got a section of the statutes, and you're wondering, what on earth did the legislature mean by these particular words or that particular words or another set of words? So we start, of course, with the statute section. So you can see here in the handout, Print McKinney's that you all know very well. I'm going to go to Westlaw, and we'll take a quick look at Lexis and Bloomberg in a moment. So just by way of review, turning to page 3, one of the sections we thought we might be interested in, Public Health 4410 for McKinney's. And turning to page 4, again, just as with federal legislative history, we want to find the all-important public law number. In state legislative history, you want to find the all-important session law number, and of course in New York we call our session laws chapter laws, just as we saw on the sources handout. So we want to find that all-important chapter law number in New York. Why is Westlaw not one? Okay, there we go. And again, to find the all-important chapter law numbers, we look in print on page 4 and the handout for the parenthetical in the end. Where do we go on Westlaw? Credits. So on Westlaw, I find it anyway, just easiest to scroll down. Credits. So our law was originally enacted when, by which chapter? And the chapter 938. And then what happened to it? Everybody? Amended? When? By? And one more time, semicolon. Chapter 7. You guys are good. Okay. And now, so we have 3 chapter laws that establish the language in the section as it currently exists today. How do we know which chapter law we need to do research for legislative history? Or are we just going to grin and bear it and do all 3? Pardon me? Right, so imagine we care about subdivision 4. So the language in there, that's what we're interested in. How do if I want to know, okay, I need to understand what the legislature was thinking when it put in the language for subdivision 4. What's the section in the annotated code, whether print or online? Anybody remember what it's called? Now you could look at all three, but between you and me, that's a lot of work. I'm going to avoid it if I can. So how do I avoid it? Okay, so give you a hint. If we're interested in legislative history, let's look at the sections that jog anybody's memory. Pardon? Editors and revisers' notes. In print, McKinney's will call it historical and statutory notes. And more specifically, in print, you will want to look at the section labeled amendments. Now, we don't see that here because there's not much there. But so if I'm interested in the language for subdivision 4, which chapter am I going to look at? So chapter 705 from what year? 1996. Like I say, no trick questions. I'll warn you when I do the trick questions. Don't worry. Okay, so here on Westlaw, we click on that. So there are a couple of different ways we can get to this point. If we know which chapter and it's a link on Westlaw, just go with the link, and then there's a tab that says Legislative History Materials. And what we find are a list of something called bill jackets. And I think that's kind of unique to New York. I won't swear New York's the only state, but it's the only one I've ever heard of that uses that term. And a bill jacket is essentially a collection of documents that were prepared as the legislature considered that particular chapter. So if we know we're interested in chapter 705, we want that particular bill jacket, right? Do you see that says chapter 705? There's other ones. There are apparently other chapters listed here that I'm basically not going to worry about because I know I'm interested in 705. And here's what a bill jacket looks like. It's pulled together some forms that are used by the legislature and a memorandum filed by the executive. It's just a collection of different, so here's a governor's program bill, a collection of different memos that were filed by a variety of different people, sometimes the legislators, sometimes the governor, sometimes interested parties. And so you can see a statement in support. Budget implications. What you will frequently find is the bill sponsor, so the legislator that introduced the bill, their memorandum in support. That's what you'll probably find most frequently. So here's actually a statement by the Office of the State Comptroller. I don't know why that particular office is interested in this bill, but you read the memo in the bill jacket and find out. And scrolling down, find all sorts of, and again, depending on how controversial the bill is, you'll find a fatter bill jacket if it's probably more interested parties chimed in on what they thought. So on Westlaw, if you are lucky, you will find a bill jacket. But the bill jackets don't go back to the beginning of time on Westlaw, and you may not have access to Westlaw. Or it also what happens in some contracts with Westlaw is that you get your state statutes, but the legislative history is outside of the plan. So again, you always want to make sure what your plan is, because it depends on how that contract is structured and how the parties negotiate. So one other source for these bill jackets is the New York State Library. And this is a totally free website, so anybody with a internet connection on the planet can get here. And if you turn the page on the handout to page 5, it's actually the New York State Archives. The reason I have this different page posted here. And these links, by the way, are on the course website. You see there is actually just a great description of what goes on both legislatively and in the bill jacket in this first paragraph, and I'll highlight. So when a bill passes, as you know, the whole process, the governor's council office collects memoranda and letters discussing the pros and cons of the bill, right? Legislative history. Materials collected may include a sponsor's memo justifying the lawmaker's introduction of the bill, council's statements, state agencies, official positions. We saw the state comptroller's memo just a moment ago. Study groups comment, so interested groups and parties, as well as opinions of bar associations, lobbyists, corporations, and private individuals. So all this stuff is submitted to the governor along with the legislation, and the governor, if the governor signs it and it becomes a chapter law, it becomes a bill jacket. There's also something called a veto jacket if the governor vetoes it. But that has less interest for us for legislative history purposes. So here's that description, and you'll see so if you were to Google New York bill jackets, you would find the New York State Library. You'll also, as I mentioned, find the link for our purposes on the class web links. Scroll down a bit. And there are a couple of little tricks to this site. So you'll notice on this page, let's go back here. So on page 5 of the walkthrough, it basically lists the bill jackets that are available. And the one trick, and I'm just showing you this because it confuses me now and again, and notice, actually important to notice, the year range. Again, limited year range. It starts in 1995 and goes only to 2014. So that's great if your chapter law falls between those years, as ours does because it's 1996, but obviously you can't always count on that. So we'll talk about what to do in those situations in a moment, but I wanted to highlight those year ranges, and then the little trick, at least the area of confusion that I find, so just passing along to you as a hint, is so you click on 2014, you think, okay, I want to look at a bill jacket for 2014, and then you get to this page, and you've got parent collection, sub-collection, and then vetoes sub-collection. What you want is the bills sub-collection. Again, don't know why that exists the way it does, but then we get to the page with the chapter laws, and then you just, again, you already have your all-important chapter law number, so you would scroll to whatever chapter number you're interested in. Now I've got 2014, so here's chapter 2. Of 2014. Now that's not one we identified. I'm just showing you this by way of example, so you can see again it looks kind of like what we saw on Westlaw. Where you scroll through, it's a little hard to read. You'd be able to see it better on your laptop, and so you have a vote record in this particular bill jacket, and then here's the memorandum of support by the sponsor. Might be able to read that there. And there are probably some other documents in there as well. So New York legislative history, bill jacket. Just if you keep those two concepts in your mind, you're doing okay. Okay, so let's take a quick look on Lexis and Bloomberg, and it's going to be a quick look because honestly neither of them are particularly useful in my opinion. So if you are somewhere that only has Lexis, my suggestion to you would be if you first understand what your contract covers and what it doesn't, because you don't want to spend a whole lot of money, especially when there's not a whole lot that's useful. There are some New York legislative histories on Lexis, but honestly, it's a moving target. They keep on moving it, and they don't make them easy to find, at least by section number. So my advice to you is call Lexis. Remember those 800 numbers, or the chat if you prefer the chat, are really useful research resources. They don't cost anything. A lot of times they'll give you great advice in terms of terminology to use, or just how to navigate around, or what's available that you may or may not know about. So really, I mean, librarians used to say the telephone is one of the greatest research resources, and I still think that's true. Of course, now we have the web also, but remember the telephone or chat, however you want to contact Lexis. So what Lexis does still have, of course, are those historical and statutory notes, editors and revisers notes on Westlaw. I just learned this morning, in fact. In New York, on Lexis, it's a little hit or miss still. Lexis is moving to formalize it and to make it uniform so that you'll always see the amendments, so you can always see the editors and revisers notes as it's known on Westlaw. But here's an example where it just doesn't exist on Lexis. And it's a publication thing. I won't bore you with the reasons. But as you see, you don't see that history note. If we go to a different section on Lexis, actually I want to go here. So instead of 4410, I'm going to go to 4406 just so you can see what it looks like when it is available on Lexis. Go to history again, and here we see editor's notes. We didn't see that with 4410. And so you can see the chapter 501 of 1992 did all this stuff, and you scroll down in 1997 did all this stuff. Keep on going. So if you don't find it on Lexis, it's not because you're doing something wrong, it's because they don't have it there yet. It's more reliable, I think, with the USC on Lexis, but not so reliable with New York. And honestly, I don't know. I don't know for other states. So if you're not finding it, use that phone number or chat. Okay. Bloomberg, not very much at all for legislative history. I promise you, Bloomberg does do a couple of things really well, which we will see in the next few weeks. But legislative history is. So you can see there's a little bit. So all I did is I went to search and I went to state. Actually, I went to legislative and regulatory and I went to state. And you can see New York legislature. Again, not a whole lot. If it were me, especially in New York, I would go to the New York Library and go to the Bill Jacket collection, assuming it's a year that's covered. One other aspect of New York legislative history before I talk about the years that aren't covered by Westlaw or the New York State Library, and that is New York legislative reports. You may or may not remember when we first started talking about legislative history, I brought up the case Chase Scientific. It was a New York case, and the New York Court of Appeals, the highest court, referred extensively to the legislative history, and I talked about how in my worldview, some enterprising young associate did some serious legislative history research, and he or she found this legislative history and won the day for their client. So that legislative history revolved around the CPLR. Those of you taking the New York bar exam will get to know the CPLR very well. And part of the CPL it revolved around was the statute of limitations. The reason that's relevant for our discussion is that there are certain major legislative initiatives in New York, like revising the entire CPLR, like revising the Uniform Commercial Code, like revising the criminal procedure, that get looked at in its entirety rather than just a single act. So as you can imagine, the CPLR is one of those. And when that happens frequently, legislative reports get issued. So in that Chase Scientific case, what that court was referring to was actually one of these legislative reports that that enterprising young associate, in my view of the world, found. How do you find these? Well, the first place you always look is when you're looking in the annotated code. And that person presumably was looking in the annotated code in the statute of limitations section, which I think is 214. Yes, I do remember that. Looking at 214, and in some of those nice annotations, it might have been the editors and revisers notes, it might have just been the history. They would have read very carefully in all that teeny print, whether in print or online, and they would have seen a reference to a legislative report. And if they didn't know what that was, hopefully they asked. And if they didn't know how to find it, if there wasn't a link, which there may not be, hopefully they asked. So keep your, at least in New York, keep your mind open. If you see a reference to a legislative report, these are actually important. One place to find them, and it's kind of hit or miss because they don't go back very far, is the New York State Assembly website. And yes, if you get a reference to a legislative report, try Googling it. Maybe you find it that way. Who knows? And maybe over time, they'll put more and more of these online more reliably, so they are findable. For now, it's very hit or miss. So you can see the New York State Assembly website. We're going to actually investigate it a little bit. We're going to look at legislative bill search and legislative info, but right now we're going to go to legislative reports. That's what we're talking about. And as you can see, not a whole lot there, only back to 2014. And so, well, this is still the beginning of 2017, so it's not a surprise there's not much there. But you can't assume because you don't see it here, it doesn't exist. Basically, if you find it here, it's your lucky day and you don't have to search further. If you don't find it here, then you have to search further. But they do exist, and they are for the legislation to which they apply. So like this major legislation, like the CPLR, like, as I said, like UCC, possibly the tax code, I'm not sure of that. They are really, really important. So if you do see a reference, keep your eyes open for them, and if you do see a reference, make sure to look at them. Like I said, whoever found that in the Chase Scientific case won the day for their client because they looked at the legislative report. Any questions so far about bill jackets, legislative reports? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how to find bill jackets when they're not between 1995 and 2014. Now, it may be on Westlaw, and again, if you have access to Westlaw and it's part of your contract, great. Check it out the way we just went through. If they are not on Westlaw, there are a couple of other places to look, and one of which is, again, this assembly site. So instead of legislative reports, we're going to look at bill search and legislative info, and that is here, and that's also on your handout on page 6. So what I did on page 6 is I went to the laws. Let's go back. Go into the laws link, and that brought me to what we're looking at on page 6. And honestly, if you typed in New York statutes, this is probably where Google would send you. So it's obviously, here is basically the statutes of New York, the code, excuse me, of New York. Statutes also. But there are other things on this page as well. And one of those, under lists, you'll see chapters. And you can see that's what's on page 6. I captured that screen. So it will give us lists of either chapters, video message, or approval messages. And right now it's not looking particularly useful, but the way you make it useful is if you have your all-important chapter law number, you say, I want to look at a chapter, and actually you can specify a chapter. So I am going to, so you see here on page 7, I looked at chapter 42 for 2014. I'm actually going to, so you can see what that looks like here. I'm going to show you up here a current chapter law, one that's not available to us anywhere else. 2014 is available on the New York State Library Digital Collections website. So if I go to chapter 7, and I'm going to tell it, I definitely want to see status. I'm not too sure about text because I'm really just looking at the legislative history. So let's summary and sponsor's memo, because we know that's one source of legislative history. So here is basically the path that Chapter 7 took to become law. You can see down here it was signed into law on Valentine's Day. And that's, a couple of weeks ago, so this site is pretty up to date. And here's the Introduces Memorandum of Support. So again, this probably is not, what you find on this site is not the full bill jacket, but it's better than what we had before, which was nothing. So again, if you're looking at very current legislation that became law. So by very current, I mean after what's available on the New York State Library website. So for now, that's 2014. Hopefully they'll update that, but they seem to be at least a few years behind. So if it's not available there, and for whatever reason it's not available on Westlaw or you don't have access to Lexis, then this is another source, the New York State Assembly site. So that's the very current stuff. What about the pre-1995 stuff? Unfortunately, that old stuff still can be important. Your section can have either been enacted or last amended, or your relevant all-important chapter law number may be prior to 1995, right? Stuff did happen way back then. Then, if you can't find it somewhere on Google, then you got to go to print. So let's take a look at that. So if you turn the page on the handout to page 8. So remember we talked about McKinney's, we talked about the black McKinney's where we find the code, and we talked about the red McKinney's where we find the session laws. Remember, session law is the generic term for, what do we call it in New York? Chapter law. And in the federal world, a session law is called public law. Again, look, if you have difficulty remembering all this terminology, because I know I throw a lot of it at you, that source's handout will give you that information. So, session laws, also known as chapter laws in New York, are in the red books where it actually says McKinney session laws. Remember, the spines are a little bit different. So McKinney session laws does a couple of things. It prints the session laws, right? It kind of makes sense. That's the title. The other, so that's in volume 1 typically, sometimes volume 1 and 2, depending on how much goes on that year. In the second or third volume, it also reproduces some of the legislative history. Maybe the sponsor's memo, maybe the governor's memo, maybe some other memo from some other interested party. For major bragging rights, anybody remember another publication that does this on the federal end? Not a trick question, just a difficult one. What's the second place that you find public laws for federal laws? Statutes at large is the official source. The unofficial source would be UScan. Oh, I heard it. I heard a couple of people said UScan. UScan works the same way. The first couple of volumes are public laws, the session laws for the federal. The later volumes are selectively reproduced legislative history documents. Interestingly, both UScan and McKinney session laws are published by the same publisher. So they have, for whatever reason, kept that strategy. For your purposes, you want to remember, oh, I find session laws in McKinney's, but I also find some of that legislative history documents. So if I cannot find the bill jacket, now I should also mention, actually, these older bill jackets are available in libraries on microfiche. Yes, I can hear everybody squirming, eek, microfiche. I do the same thing. I deal with it a lot more than you. So if you really have to look at the full bill jacket, investigate your favorite law library in New York, either us, of course, or the state law library in Mineola, or wherever else you might be in the state, since you might not be nearby to Hofstra. So the bill jackets themselves for older bill jackets do exist in microfiche in various libraries if you need to look at the full bill jacket. But if not, then if you can track down McKinney session laws, you can find older legislative history documents using your all-important chapter law numbers. So let's take a look at page 8 to see what that looks like. Going to page 9, so there's McKinney Session Laws Volume 1, so that's where we will see our actual all-important chapter. So we already identified our all-important chapters number for subdivision 4 in section 4410 was 1996, chapter 705, so that's what we're looking at here on page 9. And so we might remember from our reference, let's see if I can pull it up. let's go back to Westlaw. So here are our editors and revisers notes, and so we were interested in subdivision 4. So we discovered that that's 1996, chapter 705, but we see it's actually section 5 of chapter 705 from 1996. So turning to page 10, what a coincidence, we have a handy dandy arrow next to section 5, where it tells us section 4410 of the public health law is amended by adding a new subdivision 4 to read as follows. So again, this is just the chapter law. If we go to page 11, we'll see McKinney Session Law, Volume 2. So Volume 1, we were reading the chapter law. I'll pass this around again if you want to take another look. So we want to read the actual chapter law, go to Volume 1. If we want to look at some of the legislative history documents from way back when, we go to Volume 2. And we see, sure enough, Volume 2 covers memoranda, tables, and index. So turning to page 12 of our walkthrough handout. And it's organized by chapter number. So obviously we just turn to 705 of Volume 2. And what we would see is on page 12 of the handout. And just to get your eye used to what you might be looking at, way up in the top, we can see where the chapter number is. And then on the page, we see a reference back to the text of the law. And then we see that this is a memorandum in support from the New York State Senate. And it tells us the purpose of the law. So kind of why they passed this particular chapter. Gives us a summary. And continuing on page 13, we then see the statement in support. So we don't know that this is going to answer our question of what the legislature meant by this particular chapter, but this is about as close as we'll get in terms of what's available for legislative history documentation. So again, you'd want to look for the bill jacket. In this particular case, we'd find the bill jacket on the New York State Library, and we already saw it on Westlaw, so you wouldn't have to get to the McKinney's print. But if your bill jacket was not available in those sources, then you would might want to know about McKinney's print, especially if it's an older chapter. Any questions? So there's one other print source for older chapter laws, and it works kind of the same. And if you turn to page 15, it's called New York State Legislative Annual. And it works kind of the same because it doesn't have the session laws reprinted the way McKinney's does. It just gives you whatever legislative documents this particular publication decided to publish. And I honestly don't know how they make that decision, but it's easy enough to take a look in once you have your all-important chapter law number, because you already know the year. You go to that. Oh, mustn't forget show and tell. You go to that year, 1996, and you turn to the number, your all-important chapter number. In our case, 705. And so you can see what it looks like on page 16. The 1996 New York State Legislative Annual. Just turning to the right number, 705 in number order, we see a Governor's Program Bill memorandum. And if you did a compare and contrast, you see that this document is not the same as what we saw in McKinney's. So if you didn't have access to an online version, it would have been worth your while to check both sources. That's not always the case. Sometimes what's in the New York Legislative Annual duplicates what's already in McKinney's. But once you're, as we will see, because we will be doing a workshop using these titles, we're taking a field trip down to the library later on, as you will see, they're right next to each other, so it's pretty easy to check both sources. It doesn't take too much extra time. And so on page 17, you see the chapter law memoranda. The Governor's Program Bill continues on page 17. And we go to page 18. We see that there's another one. the governor's approval memoranda. So here's the governor indicating when he signs the bill why he thinks it's a good idea. Any questions about using McKinney's session laws and New York Legislative Annual for research for older chapter legislative histories? Okay, and before said workshop, one other resource, depending again on where you are working. So there is our legislative history. Something called a company called the New York Legislative Service. So there's a company in New York City that will compile legislative histories for you. Of course, they charge money for this. So again, depending on your situation, this is a possibility. If for whatever reason you cannot get to New York, you cannot identify your particular bill jacket, this is a possibility. I don't know that other states have this, but that would be something you could probably go to a state research guide, as I was suggesting, either a legislative history one or a general one, or call a state library. Most states have state libraries. Hopefully all do again. And you can give them a call and they might be able to direct you to a particular state's resource that will do it for a fee. Any questions? Okay, so as promised, we're going to go down to the library and do a workshop. You will need your laptops, and don't log out of them because the first few questions are laptop questions. And then I will ask you to look at McKinney session laws and New York Legislative Annual. I have some tables reserved right here where the books are. And then the plan is after we're done with the workshop, we'll take our break and then come back up and do a wrap-up of legislative history. Any questions? Cool. Oh, and we will do a wrap-up as well as finish the federal legislative history workshop. So workshop, wrap-up, workshop. So once I have the all-important public law number, I'm going to use that. I could try the popular name. But the popular name, you might come up with different public law numbers. Like remember, we were looking at the Civil Rights Act, bless you. Civil Rights Act is the Civil Rights Act, and there's a whole bunch of amendments. And which one do you want to look at? If I have the all-important public law number, that's going to get me to the one I want to look at. So we know 93-406 for ERISA. And again, shortcut to 406. So there we see ERISA. And I usually like to look at the most detailed one I can if I'm doing in-depth legislative intent research. And the reason why I like Hein Online is the first place to go, if they have my all-important public law number, is it lets me search all of those 22 volumes. So if I want to search for preemption, and I looked at Hein Online and discovered that the star is my truncation symbol, so I'll get preempt, preemption, preempted, all that good stuff. And that's it. Learn that in the help. Now again, I want to look at the reports first, because best source for legislative intent, and for whatever, well, because of alphabetizing, I have to click on show more, and then I can tell Hein I want to look at House and Senate reports. Okay. And so here I see exactly where my term appears in these various reports, and I can click through and take a look and see how that word comes up in the various reports. I still probably, well, not know probably about it, I will still definitely want to look at the section by section analysis. I'll still want to scroll through and see if the committee talks generally about why they enacted ERISA. But especially if you've got a very specific phrase you're looking for, the searchability on Hein is really useful. If you either don't have access to Hein or Hein doesn't cover your public law, you may want to look at ProQuest. And again, if you don't have access to ProQuest where you work, you're welcome to come here. And back here on the library page, and I'm just going to use our search tool on the home page to search for ProQuest. Once again, log in. Keep my fingers crossed, it's working. It is working. I'm going to tell it which library, because it's asking. Ta-da! And remember on ProQuest, you want to click on Search for Legislative Histories. And then I can search for my public law number. Hopefully you're getting the sense of why I keep on calling it the all-important, either public or chapter law number, because all of the resources we're using, that's the basic piece of information we need to get where we need to go. And ProQuest is pretty complete in terms of pulling together all of the documents for our particular public law number, but it doesn't give us the searchability. Okay, any questions? So one last point on ProQuest, because this also confuses everybody, understandably, because it's confusing. You were asking Michelle about conference reports. Congress.gov gives you that very nice little conf report, so it tells you. ProQuest doesn't. It drives me nuts. The best way to find the conference report on ProQuest is go to the first, make sure that there was one, because there isn't always a conference report. If both House and Senate agree, sometimes what happens is the Senate will go through and pass a bill, and then they'll send that version over to the House. The House will pass that bill, so it's both the same, so there's no need for a conference. So the way I determine that there is a conference is Control-F, and I type in the word conference. And if the word conference comes up, that's telling me, oh, there's a conference report. ProQuest isn't going to tell me which report that is, which, as I said, is a flaw in this particular database. So that's, once I know that there's a conference, I will scroll down to the end of reports. And yes, I know this is involved, and I wish there were an easier way, believe me. It's the end of reports, and I will take a look at the last couple. And once I click on the report, it will give me a summary, and it will tell me, conference report. And that happened to be the last one. So typically it'll be the last one or two. And as I said, not great, a lot to remember. If there's an easier way, believe me, I tell you. Questions? So again, you're not going to use legislative, some of you may never do legislative history research after this class, legislative intent research, or legislative history research after this class. Possibly some of you will. I have run into former students who were so glad that they understood this. I mentioned also when we started this unit that I speak with law firm librarians who work with associates and partners on occasion, and inevitably on their wish list of things we wish new associates would know, it's how this works. They don't expect you to know all the details, and you may not remember ProQuest and conference report and all that stuff, but to have a basic understanding of what a committee report is and why you want to look at it, how the process works. And actually, I did promise you one other thing, and then I promise we'll stop and we'll go back to the workshop. If you do get a reference for a House report and there's no link, or a Senate report and there's no link, one, Google it. By all means, Google it. If you don't get it via Google, another place to look is our friend FDSys, FedSys, or GovInfo. GovInfo is the beta version of FedSys. Eventually, GovInfo will take over FedSys, but right now I think FedSys is a little easier to use. So you'll see here, there's a link for conference reports. Hopefully your Google search will actually pick that up, but not always. And the other, if you do get a reference to a document that you really want to look at and you can't figure out how, ask. Give us, if you can't come to your favorite law library, give us a call, or find another law school that you're close by to give a call. We take phone calls from attorneys and work with attorneys all the time that aren't even those who aren't Hofstra grads, but of course we give special attention to those of you who are or will be Hofstra grads. Okay, that's it. I promise. Any questions? Okay, so I'm going to distribute